Hey, how you doing everyone? Today we're installing the Apex engineered S30 front lower control arms. It's gonna be a pretty long video, so hope you're sitting down for this guy. All right, so let's see what you're gonna get. You're gonna get a handful of items, actually more than a handful, you can barely fit. Look at these beautiful tension arms. They are 6061 scallop tube instead of round because they are rigid. And you got a Heim joint on one end and a solid eye on the other. You're gonna have a jam nut on both ends. They're gonna be one's right hand threaded and the other one's gonna be left hand threaded for easy caster adjustment. This is gonna be really nice because you just gotta turn one way and it'll extend out, and turn the other way and it'll shorten it. So next you'll have two of these 6061 step washers, and then you'll have two of these sway bar links. Now these sway bar links are gonna come pre-assembled from us, but in case you ever need replacement parts or wanna know, you'll have a pair of these tiny little rod ends. You'll have a pair of these jam nuts. And then you'll have four of the sway bar washers and four of the sway bar bushings. And then to top it off, you'll have the 3/8 bolt that's gonna be finely threaded into the rod end itself. Next, you're gonna have these U-brackets. Now notice these U-brackets are only single hold, and versus the crossmember U-brackets have 3 holes. For the sake of this video, because we're only gonna try to isolate the front control arm install, we're gonna use the single hole brackets. If you have the crossmember or order the crossmember in the future, those would get replaced with the 3-hole larger brackets. So for this install, we're gonna grab these guys and get those out of there. And the piece of resistance is gonna be your front lower control arms. Now, man, this powder coat is freaking moist, and you know it. Now, these are really nicely built. They go full gusseted and they're greasable. So these have incredible strength and incredible longevity. Now, the way that these all go together is you're gonna have a pair of these 3/4 rod ends, followed by a pair of the 3/4 left-hand jam nut, a double adjuster nut, and then a 1-inch jam nut, followed by the control arm body. And then we'll have the ball joint assembly. The ball joint assembly is going to encapsulate of a lot of things inside of it, which are mostly going to be hidden. But you'll have the castle nut on top, you have a cotter pin on there, don't forget that washer, and you'll have this end cap. Now, install the end cap is going to have a few items, and we're going to break them down right here. So hidden inside the ball joint itself, you're gonna have these few items. You'll have obviously the ball joint stud, followed by the end cap. And the end cap has a nylon insert, and this allows wear and tear on just the nylon. The reason why is because this allows for a quiet and comfortable ride. As to a regular solid spherical joint, it can get pretty rough and pretty loud quickly. Now, one thing to note is when installing or ever replacing the end cap, don't forget about this little set screw we have. Generally, these end caps never really wear out, or at least not for thousands and thousands of miles, but eventually if they do, you can just give us a call and order one up. Don't forget to put grease in it, because oftentimes people forget, and I'm going to remind you once more, put grease in the ball joints. Now, the studs are hardened 4340. These things are beefy. Now, one thing to note is they have little grooves cut into them and this little weight reduction hole. Wow, look at that.
Let's get a look at that.
Now, we have these little grooves to circulate the grease really well. They can pivot in the socket hole, and the grease can move around and grease the whole thing. I said grease a lot there. Now, don't forget this little cotter pin hole. It's gonna come in handy when you put in the knuckle. Now, stop drooling over these and let's get these installed on the car finally. But before we install, I'm gonna tease you a little bit with this vacuum sealed hardware pack. Inside the hardware pack, you're gonna have a plethora of stuff. That's a word I haven't used in a while. So let's start amateurizing these. You're gonna have a pair of these 1/2-inch bolts. Next, you're gonna have a pair of these 5/8 socket, 5/8 carriage bolts. Then you'll have 5/8 large washers. Then you'll have the 3/4 thick washers and 9/16 thick washers. After that, you'll have 4 of the large misalignment spacers, and you'll have 4 mini misalignment spacers. You'll have a pair of the 3/8 socket head bolts, and followed by 3/8 washers and 3/8 nylon lock nuts. After that, you're gonna have a pair of 5/8 washers, 4 5/8 lock nuts, 4 1/2-inch washers, and 4 nylon lock nuts. For this install, you're gonna get a 1/2-inch drive ratchet. You're gonna need a 1/2" drive Allen wrench, a adjustable wrench, a 5/16 Allen key, followed by a 15/16 socket, a 7/8 socket, a 3/4 socket, and a 9/16 socket. That's a lot of stuff. Finally we get to installing. So using a 17mm socket, go ahead and take those knuckle bolts off, remove the strut. I know we really rushed that, but that's common sense. Come on, guys. You're gonna remove that nut with a 22mm socket, but of course we're gonna use a Allen key, pound that guy out, and remove that knuckle. Now there are gonna be two things that you gotta loosen up here. You're gonna have the control arm to the cross member and the tension arm to the chassis. Go ahead and remove the control arm with a 3/4 nut. Now I know it's a SAE socket on a metric bolt, but it'll work. Now smack that bolt out of there and pull it out through that hole. Now get that control arm loose out of that cross member. And then using the adjustable wrench, go ahead and loosen up the nut on the back of that tension arm and pull that sucker right out of there. Remove the bushing and you're got a clean slate. Now next thing you're gonna do is you're gonna pop that 5/8 carriage bolt through that U-bracket, and you can see from the other side that the square hex protrudes a little. That is where the 3/4 washer goes in. It's a thick washer on purpose to make sure that has a nice flat seal. Slide that 3/4 thick washer through there, and after that you'll notice you have just thread access. You're gonna slide the aluminum step washer to pretty much align that in. Now make sure you have the lip of the aluminum step washer out so then it goes into the chassis. That's gonna align into that hole so it removes any lateral movement. Let's go and put that into the hole there, and zoinks. And one thing to note is the holes for the U-bracket is always to be parallel to the ground. You want it to go this way. You do not want this turned up and down because that's not what it's designed for, and the bearing will wear out prematurely. Always parallel to the ground, left to right, and it's horizontal. Oh no. And then you're gonna grab your 5/8 large washer and stick it onto the threads of the carriage bolt, followed by the 5/8 nylon lock nut. You're gonna go ahead and zip that on there, and I would recommend just getting it pretty loose still. You don't want to tighten everything up, but at least enough that it will hold its place. Then using your 15/16 socket, go ahead and tighten that down. You want to leave it a little bit loose just for a little bit of minute adjustments later on. Next we're going to go ahead and start installation on the control arm. First thing you're going to do is you're going to grab those large misalignment spacers and slip those into the control arms. Then you're going to grab the 9/16 thick washers. There's going to be 6 provided with the kit, but chances are you're only going to need 4. We're putting 1 in front and behind. Now keep in mind you can use those for caster adjustment. Use the factory bolt, slip that through the cross member, the washers, and the high misalignment spacers, and go ahead and use the factory nut and tighten that back down. And a cautionary tale here is you always want to make sure that this rod end is going straight this way towards the chassis. You never want it rotated. You can move this way and isolate that way, that is fine, but you never want to have these twisting. You want to make sure that it's directly in line and as the most safest way to install. Go ahead and torque to the factory specs. And after that, we're gonna go ahead and install the tension arm. To start, you're gonna grab the small misalignment spacers and put those into the bearing side. Slip both of those in there. After that, oh, there it is. After that, you're gonna make sure that that moves freely. You're gonna grab the 1/2" washer, slip it over the 1/2" bolt, and get that onto the U-bracket. Put your tension arm in the middle of those two. Grab the other 1/2" washer, place that on the other side along with the 1/2" nut, and thread those on there. Go ahead and torque the nut down with a 3/4 inch socket and 3/4 inch wrench to about 40 foot-pounds. And now slide the tension arm into the control arm, and now they are married. Congratulations, you two. Now one thing to note is we're gonna try to keep the tension arm closest to the ball joint. It is safer, but as you extend this bung adjuster nut or double adjuster, oftentimes it messes up your caster, so you can move this down if you need to. Next, grab your 5/8 socket head bolt, and from there your 5/8 washer. It's gonna be the smaller washer, don't get it confused with the larger one. Go and slip that underneath there, and then grab the 5/8 nut and go ahead and thread that onto the socket head bolt. Now one thing you're gonna wanna do is after it's all installed, remember to torque that down to 65 foot-pounds. Now look at the flick of the wrist on this one. As I turn this turnbuckle one way and the other way, it makes it longer and shorter. Essentially what that does is allows me to change my caster on the fly. No unbolting, just twist and turn. That's about it. Make sure you loosen up those jam nuts before you do so, and then once you set your caster at the place that you want to, tighten up those jam nuts. All right before you tighten everything up, also make sure you pay attention to the heim joint on the tension arm. You're going to want to do it in the same practice as a front lower control arm to cross member. You want to keep that tension arm heim joint pretty much straight up and down in the center of the U-bracket. You don't want it cocked or anything like that, otherwise you'll prematurely wear out your bearings. Now look at that, effortless. Gosh, don't you want that? I know you do. Now look at that, I can do it with one finger. Pretty easy, huh? All right, now moving on, one last thing that we're gonna do is make sure you grease the ball joint. I know some of you guys are gonna forget it, so I'm gonna say it one more time out loud. Let's remove this cotter pin and get installing the knuckle. And now after you remove that cotter pin, let's remove that castle nut and that washer, and then go ahead and install the knuckle right onto the ball joint. Now one thing that you'll notice is that ball joint is gonna squeeze that dust boot down, and that's gonna create a nice seal. Now go ahead and install the washer and castle nut, and make sure you install that cotter pin. Now the castle nut you're going to want to torque down to about 60 foot-pounds. So installing the sway bar link is pretty straightforward. They slide in between these two tabs, and it's got holes front and back. As you extend the control arm, you can use any of those holes. We're going to use this one right here. You're going to use the 3/8 socket head bolt, slip that through, then followed by a 3/8 washer on the other end and a 3/8 nut. Now using a 9/16 wrench and your 5/16 Allen key, go ahead and tighten that down. Now you're gonna have to imagine installing a sway bar. Close your eyes and imagine it. Actually, don't close them because you gotta still watch this video. To install the sway bar, you're gonna remove the nut, the washer, and the bushing, put the sway bar in between, and then tighten it back down. Installing the S30 front lower control arm, there is really no chassis modification required. However, some things to be aware of is also going to be dependent on ride height. The sway bar link sometimes has a tendency to bind at very, very low ride heights. That will not usually be the case unless you're really planning to slam the car. However, an easy fix to that is going to be adding a sway bar spacer onto the chassis to drop the sway bar, and that'll allow you to have the sway bar link move freely.